So we're going to go over a few different groups of or types of families, certain categories of families that you might be interacting with in your role as a professional, and a few notes about what communication might look like when you interact with those particular groups. So the first category we're going to cover is a diversity in culture or language. This refers to cultures and languages that are other than your either first language or natural culture, however you find yourself most familiar in the world. One thing to point out that's very important is that culture very much impacts how we relate to one another, impacts our relationships in our family, but also our expectations of relationships outside of the family. There is there are a lot of ways to generalize culture, but they are just that, generalizations. Culture definitely has a tremendous amount of variability within it. It's worth noting that within the same cultural group, there's a vast array of differences within those people who consider themselves a part of the same culture group. So it's worth considering that there are subcultural groups within a broader culture, but also that each individual, of course, is individual. I liked the way at one point in the text it was suggested that that a person asked themselves, within this person's given culture, is the behavior that I'm seeing from them normal, normative, typical, pathological, problematic, things like that. It's a little like taking on the frame of reference of the other to the best of your ability to try to contextualize what their behaviors are. This leads to a unique idea of a balance between how one is expected to behave in one's culture and how that's in balance with how the broader society expects an individual to carry themselves. So especially in our more broad American society, there's lots of different cultural groups, and the way that we are having to balance our cohabitation in this in our nation is to understand that different cultures have expectations about behaviors and roles and things, and that has to be in some kind of a peaceful balance with the broader blending of cultures in society. Overall, I think that a really important attitude or stance to take as a professional is not one in which you try to master another's culture so that you understand it fully inside and out. It's more that you maintain a caring interest toward learning continually more and more about that person's culture. You'll likely never fully master or comprehend even your own culture, much less the culture of another. And to do this, it's useful to take what I think of as a not knowing stance. This doesn't mean playing dumb, it just means understanding humbly that there's always more for you to find out about something, even that you think you understand deeply. There's, of course, a lot of hindrance related to language when there are different languages spoken between, say, the parent of a child you're working with and yourself. Interpreters can be a wonderful tool, and also finding ways to interpret written communication not only will be useful but will be vital in order to maintain a relationship at all with the family. There's a useful table in your text outlining a few considerations about nonverbal communications across different types of culture. But really briefly, just I wanted to point out that in a lot of cases, people respond in ways that will allow them to feel as comfortable as possible. And so that might lead to trying to save face, trying not to look stupid, trying not to look unusual, trying not to look awkward. And this can be, the people resort back to expectations that they have been trained in from an early age. So that will relate to a lot of different nonverbals and patterns of communication that will be helpful to be able to predict so that you can try to help them through the difficulties along with that. Shifting gears to socioeconomic concerns related to diverse populations. There does happen to be a very strong correlation between work success, academic success, and overall school success with socioeconomic status. It's a very tight correlation or determining factors. And along the poverty line, or in the poverty group, we can also assume that there's quite a lot of impact on the family and the individual's mental health, influencing parenting styles, even the values of the family, types of support they might have. And it's also really worth noting, this isn't something I think that a lot of people very much know, but that the way that a person understands their own financial limitation, their own poverty, if they are in under the poverty line, the way that a person views their own poverty is very much related to the environment that they live in. For instance, there's quite an extremely high rate of crime, violent crime, in areas where there is a high prevalence of poverty and a high prevalence of impoverished families who live in close proximity to those who are not impoverished. So in other words, when there's a population of people living in poverty who can very readily see people in their town, in their city, who are not living in poverty as they are, then violent crime tends to increase. In areas where everyone's impoverished, they face their own struggles, of course, but the resulting violence, increase of violence that you see elsewhere isn't present. It seems as though they see those who live in broadly impoverished areas without the comparison of others who are not living in poverty. They quite likely have a feeling that this is where everyone is, and there's not the violent backlash in society that you'll find. So it makes a difference where you live and who lives around you, in other words. It's worth pointing out within families, I like the phrase invisible strategies that came out of our reading. Things that parents and other family members do that will very easily go unnoticed, that they do for the well-being and benefit of their child. Bringing that out and highlighting it and celebrating it will be really important for you to encourage them through your relationship to them. On the other side of things, those who tend to be from more advantaged families, there are different challenges to face as the professional interacting with them. There is statistically a different level of involvement in parents in advantaged families. They do tend to be more involved at school. There's more resources and opportunity for them to be. And as a part of that, one consideration might be that you may very well need to rely on your own sense of assertiveness in those situations. It can be, but isn't always the case, that parents who are very heavily involved may tend to have expectations or assumptions that you're there so that they can make decisions and you follow them through. So setting up your own level of assertiveness will allow you to be able to maintain the integrity of the program that you're a part of and take consideration of the parents' opinions and hopes to be a part of that. There also tends to be a pretty broad assumption at times that Those who are from advantaged families will do well in school, and those who are from less advantaged families will do less well. And although there are significant statistical relations between successes and socioeconomic status, it's not always the case that performance definitely results from their SES. Okay, so with disabilities, we have, of course, a whole nother class devoted to talking about disabilities, but in this case related to communicating with families with disabilities, with a child with disabilities. It's really important to remember that there are legal guidelines to follow, and this relates to the referral process. It relates to ways in which families have both rights and responsibilities as a part of the process of referral and assessment and so on. Generally, communication should be clear, devoid of a lot of acronyms, trying to bring it down to a common speech. Communication should be timely, and communication should, to the best of your ability, be documented. Anytime there's legal guidelines involved, documentation is extremely important. In general, what I really recommend you all do is when you find yourself employed somewhere and you in a place where you may work with someone with special needs, contact and get to know the leaders in the special education departments there. They will have hopefully had some experience going through different processes like referrals, and take all that you have learned from your experiences through school and before then, and combine that with their experience and expertise. When communicating with families with a member with disabilities, compassion and understanding can very much be an important part of the process for them. Parents and other family members may very well experience symptoms of grief or go through stages of grief when a child is diagnosed with a disability. And it's an important thing to remember because your communication can be tilted slightly toward an emotional or empathic or compassionate communication, and that can really strengthen the relationship. The way a person understands disability is important also in communicating that with them. And that can be influenced in large part by culture, religion, how they have been taught to understand certain disabilities, and so on. In general, directly, language should be person first, which we've talked about before. A child with Down syndrome, not a Down syndrome child. A child who has autism, not an autistic kid. Although the language should also be value neutral. So it's easy sometimes to try for person first language and end up saying something like a person suffering with autism, or a person who experiences the pains of some other disability. And although there are a lot of challenges related to disabilities, of course, we don't want to make the value assumption that parts of that are bad for the child in their life. We should instead be strengths based, but also very clear on some of the limitations that you might notice. Lastly, gifts and talents, or children who have been considered gifted or talented. There is a legal framework for providing services for children with gifts and talents. And it will be part of your job to identify or to be vigilant or watchful for certain indicators of particular gifts and talents. In general, a child who has an exceptional memory, who has a wide curiosity about lots of things, a very, very deep knowledge base for certain areas of interest beyond the scope of other children their age, an exceptional reading ability and comprehension ability, things like that are somewhat pointers to gifts and talents, in addition to an exceptional problem-solving ability, things like that. In which case you may very well need to adjust or adapt the curriculum you put forward. And now if you're end up in an early child care setting, you still have curriculum. You still have developmental ideas about where you're headed with the child, of course, and that as the child ages may need to be adapted to what they need. Also, parent involvement can be challenging because they may require or may be able to use additional services outside of the facility where you work. That will involve possible transportation and financial extra burdens on the parents. And also, what could be really helpful for you, for the family, is for you to suggest different enriching opportunities that they may take part in at home. That will be a good way to give the child some of the services that provide them with what some of the services provide them, but for them to be able to do that at home. Okay, so there's a light assignment related to this week's lesson, because I want you to make sure that you have some time to start with, to begin on the communication experiments. And so I've given a pretty detailed outline of what this looks like in your PowerPoint, so make sure to look over that as opposed to simply the syllabus and the and online on Blackboard. The bulk of the information is in this PowerPoint. So I've given you 6 communication experiments scenarios. So what I'm going to ask you to do is enter into dialogue or conversation in these 6 scenarios. And prior to those experiences, choose at least 2 components of active listening, 2 components of responding appropriately, and 2 components of maintaining a professional stance to focus on. So that's a total of 6 of the skills we've talked about that I'm going to ask you to focus on in these conversations. So in active listening, I'm going to focus on reflective dialogue and or reflection and on providing feedback maybe and deferring judgment, say. So I'm going to focus on those 2 things as I enter into conversation. From responding appropriately, I may decide to focus on maybe being able to use assertiveness, or also allow the aspects of responding appropriately related to the variations of my responses. So like providing suggestions versus advice or urging. And from maintaining a professional stance, maybe I might choose to enter into the problem solving model, or exercise some of the view deconstructing questions. Okay, so those would be 6 different components that I know, okay, I'm going to use these and try to exercise them in these conversations. They don't all have to be a part of each conversation. They're pretty much spread out throughout these 6 scenarios. But I want you to be able to identify when you've used them. So the 6 scenarios that I'm going to ask you to engage in will be with self. That literally means that I want you to practice one or more of these components by yourself, like in front of a mirror. With a knowing friend or family member, that means with someone who knows what you're doing, knows that you're doing this project with them. And for that, I want you to actually set up the opportunity to video record your conversation. Okay, so a 3 to 5 minute video showing you and this person interacting through conversation. And I'll tell you what more I'm gonna have you do with that on the next slide. And the remaining 4 are with people who don't know that you're engaged in these experiments. You don't video those people who don't know that you're doing this experiment, but practice with some of these components with an unknowing friend or family member, with an unknowing acquaintance, maybe a classmate who you're not very close to, or another person you work with an unknowing, what I call a sandpaper person. This is a person with whom you have a hard time getting along, a person that you might not like very much, a person that you have trouble communicating with, and then with an unknowing stranger, just someone at the grocery store, at the gas station, coffee shop, something like that. you happen to engage in some kind of communication with them, try to use one of the components you've chosen. So when you've done that, the 3 to 5 minute video, I'd like for you to submit, and then submit a 2-page reflection on your experiences covering all the experiments, but kind of highlighting the one that you videoed, specifically describing what you did in the video. Describe to me what components you chose to exercise and what you wanted to do during the video, and describe how you feel it went. How hard was it to prepare for them? Was it awkward? Things like that. And this is going to be due on November the 17th by the end of the day. I wanted to cover the last 2 major grades for this course that are going to be due on the final week, which is the exam week. And we will be meeting for our second face-to-face meeting on Thursday, December the 5th at 1:30. This is in room 2024 in the HEC building. And for that period of time, we're going to go through the family involvement and communication plan. There are 2 sides to this. One is the written portion, which you'll be able to submit to me. You can give that to me in person, and you can submit it online. I'd like for you to bring it, however, so that I make sure I know what I'm watching as we go through the class, or what I'm participating in. But basically, the written portion will follow the kind of prompt questions I give you on the following slide. But while we're meeting during the face-to-face, we're actually going to be acting out a scenario, showing a meeting or a conference with a family member or some family members, with parents or grandparents or whoever's acting for the child, whoever's the guardian for the child. You have a couple options. You can ask classmates. They can be from our class or not. I don't mind if they're not a part of the class. They do have to come with you, obviously. And the point of this will be for you to act out as the facilitator of the meeting, so as the teacher or the professional, and going through this conference or this meeting with this imagined family member. It should follow your plan, your written plan, and I need to see certain skillful means of communication that we've discussed throughout our course. Okay, so I want to see that you can convincingly listen with active listening, that when you respond to them, you respond appropriately, as we've talked about, and that you maintain a professional stance throughout. So I'm not listing how many components I want to see. I just want to see generally your active listening, you're successfully active listening, you're responding appropriately, and you're maintaining a professional stance. So that's kind of a tying together of all the stuff that we've done. If you don't want to ask other classmates or people to be a part of this, I don't mind being a part of the role play, as long as you just give me the information about the family. So you'll tell me who I'll play or who I'll role play as. You can give me the written portion that day, right before we go through the scenario. I don't need a preparation time or anything. You just hand it to me and we'll start. But you know that that's an option for you. There's a list of do's and don'ts on page 90 and 91 of your text about creating an environment that is conducive to relationship building communication. Do try to look over those and try to make those a part of your plan as well. With the written portion that I basically gave you 7 prompting questions. Do your best not to give one line or one word responses. I would like for you to give me a thoughtful and thorough answer from each of these prompts, so that I have some idea about what the family is and what your plan is to handle the meeting or the conference with them. This will, as I mentioned, be due the last time we'll meet, so the written portion will be due by the time we meet at 1:30, and then obviously we'll go through the actual role play, and that'll be the grade for that. The research paper is the last thing that's due. I've given you an extra day after that last meeting, so Friday the 6th by the end of the day. The reason it's not going to be the Sunday of that week is that I'll have to submit grades the following week, and I'll really just need the extra time over the weekend to get all of those graded. But that's pushing it to about as late as I can do it for the last part of the exam week. So know that that'll be due then. All right, so there's one assignment on Blackboard that I'd like for you to complete for this week, and in general take some time to begin your communication experiments. Take this time also to allow for clarification questions to be sent to me so that you make sure you feel good about these last few things in our class, these major grades in our class, and I'll do my best to clear them up the best I can, so let me know if you need any help.